Greetings and welcome back to Ghost Stories of Washington. Continuing in Chapter 1, Haunted Houses, these next two stories are called The Castle and Sam Lives Here. In our first story, The Castle. Given its long and colorful history, no one should be surprised to learn that there is at least one haunted house in Seattle's historic Georgetown district. The particular house to which I refer to is a very large old building with many spooky tales surrounding it. Construction on the mansion began in either the late 1890s or the early 1900s. The enormous home was described by one person as being a rambling structure, complete with attic, basement, tower, and gables. But by the mid-1970s, however, the structure was not only haunted but badly dilapidated. The residence had been vacant for a decade by that time, and those years of abandonment had not been kind. The glass in most of the windows had been shattered. The porch was sinking in on itself, and the yard was a tangle of weeds and dead leaves. All in all, the property was a depressing prospect as a real estate investment. Despite its terrible condition, an art dealer, whom we shall call Edward, was drawn to the house from the moment he first laid eyes on it. Just days later, he bought the building in a flurry of ambitious plans to restore the place to its original splendor. To complete the restoration in the most efficient manner possible, Edward decided that he must live in the house while he worked on it, and Edward lived alone. As he settled into bed, preparing to enjoy the first night in his new house, Edward was only slightly unnerved by all of the noises he heard around him. He was more than happy to write those creaking sounds off as being the types of settling noises that such an old structure would naturally make. But when he heard a woman's voice crying, "No, no, no," he knew that he was dealing with something less natural than supernatural. This conclusion was confirmed by the sudden drop in temperature that accompanied the wailing. Shivering with cold and fear, the poor man listened in horror to the sounds of a vicious brawl that seemed to be occurring directly above his bedroom. Again and again he heard the woman's voice cry out as loud thumps shook the ceiling over his head. He was certain that a terrible fight was taking place one floor up from the bed where he lay. He was equally sure, however, that he was alone in the house. As Edward tried to align the two conflicting realities in his mind, the sounds of struggle reached a crescendo. Then, for no apparent reason, the dreadful noise abruptly stopped. For a few seconds, all was silent. Then Edward began to hear the sounds of heartbreaking weeping. Eventually, even those quiet whimpers ceased, and the home was once again peaceful. Comfort and warmth had returned to the room at the precise moment when the sounds had stopped. Edward fell into a fitful sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, he decided that the whole experience had to be a product of his overactive imagination. To support his conclusion, the man somewhat nervously made his way upstairs. Upon opening the door of the room above, what the man saw confirmed his initial assessment. There was a lot of work that needed to be done to that place, but there was nothing to indicate that anyone had been in the room recently. Certainly, there were no indications of the terrible struggle that Edward had thought he'd overheard just hours before. Edward tried to put the previous night's ordeal out of his mind during the day, and for the most part, he was able to do just that. He kept busy cleaning and preparing what he hoped would once again be a charming and attractive home. As night fell, he began to feel uneasy. Rather than spending a relaxing evening enjoying a sense of accomplishment, Edward kept pushing himself until he was too exhausted to work any longer. It was nearly midnight when the man slipped into bed, certain he would fall asleep immediately. But as soon as his head hit the pillow, the piteous wailing noise began again. His bedroom suddenly became icy cold, and he was once again listening to the sounds of a life and death struggle, followed by terrible weeping and moaning. This time the crying seemed to come from all over the house. Choking back panic and the urge to flee, Edward let his heart and mind go out to whatever was causing the disturbance in the house. Initially, he doubted his own sanity, but once he had calmed himself sufficiently, the man realized that he was listening to phantom sounds, ghostly remnants of an awful struggle that had occurred in this house many, many years before. Determined to discover what terrible incident had caused the house to become so dreadfully haunted, he began to investigate the history. It seems that the previous owners vacated the place because they could no longer stand living with the floor rattling racket that filled the house every night. At least Edward now knew that he was neither losing his mind nor imagining things, so he took his research to another level. It was then that the art dealer learned the truth. The phantom fight was believed to have been taking place in the house, whether it was empty or occupied, every night since at least 1910. Rather than making Edward more frightened about staying in the house, this information made him all the more determined to get to the bottom of the story and to remain in his new home. Using the archival newspaper stories, the homeowner finally put together the last pieces of the puzzle. Early in its history, the enormous house had served for a time as a brothel. At 12:30 a.m., in a room on the third floor, a young prostitute had been beaten to death by her lover, Manny. The house had apparently been haunted ever since, hosting a spectral recreation of the ghastly crime night after night. Variations on the ghost story describe a female apparition with eyes that burned like coal, wearing a long white flowing gown, and her grabbing at her own throat. Some think the ghost is the spirit of Sarah, the granddaughter of the man who built the house. Perhaps the positive energy that Edward brought to the haunted house has, by now, created peace for all the old mansion's inhabitants, the living and the dead. In our second story, continuing in chapter 1, Sam Lives Here. They always referred to the spirits in their very haunted house by the single moniker Sam. Even so, the family had been and seen ample proof that their home was haunted by far more than just one ghost. Try as I might, I could not learn the true identity of this family, who lived in the Seattle suburb of Kirkland more than 35 years ago. At the time the haunting was active, however, the facts of the case were carefully documented by journalist Don Duncan of the Seattle Times. For our purpose here, we shall call the afflicted family the Macmillans. Their adventures with the supernatural began in 1962, shortly after they moved into their new home. Mr. Macmillan, a successful businessman who prided himself on the astute dealings, was extremely pleased with the final price he had paid for the large, luxurious, and almost new split-level home. Little did he know at the time that he and his family were to end up with a far more than they had bargained for in this house. Signs of the haunting surfaced not long after the empty moving truck had driven away. Billiard balls on the family's pool table in the game room began to mysteriously move about on the felt surface when no one was near them. Other games, those powered by electricity, operated in short bursts when they were not turned on, and Macmillan reported that the furniture rearranged itself. At first, because they were new to the house, no one in the family said a word to anyone else about the strange goings on that by now each family member had noticed. It wasn't until Mr. Macmillan asked what he thought was an innocent question that such discussions began. As he arrived home from work one afternoon, Macmillan glanced at the house from his car and was surprised to see an elderly couple standing in his living room, looking out the window toward the street. He knew he had never seen these people before, and even stranger than their presence in his home was the way they were dressed. They wore, the man later explained, very old-fashioned clothing. Curious, Macmillan parked his car in the garage and made his way into the house. Because he was certain that his wife was entertaining guests in the living room, he was astonished to find her working in the kitchen, preparing the family meal as usual. "Where's our company?" he inquired. Company? Mrs. Macmillan assured her husband that there was no one in the house but the two of them. To make absolutely sure the strangers had not somehow gained access to their home, the couple carefully searched the place from top to bottom. "I think we need to talk," Mr. Macmillan declared when they were through. His statement finally paved the way for a long overdue conversation. Moving furniture, moving billiard balls, electric games that would clang and bang even when there was no power nor anyone near them. They both admitted that they had noticed these things. Then there was the apparitions that Mr. Macmillan had been so clearly and seen so clearly today. What was happening here? "I don't know," Mrs. Macmillan replied, "but I do know who it was you saw in our living room." "You do? Then why didn't you tell me before? Who are they?" the woman's husband demanded. Yet Mrs. Macmillan explained that while she didn't know the couple's identity, she was somewhat familiar with their presence because she had recently watched in shocked amazement as two men dressed in clothes from a previous era appeared from within a closet, walked along the hall, and disappeared again into a bedroom. After well over an hour's discussion, the couple came to no conclusion except to agree that they would keep the knowledge of their strange surroundings a complete secret. No one, not even their children, must know. They did not want to be seen as odd in the eyes of their peers in the community. Several weeks later, the Macmillans' daughter, whom we shall call Susan, came home from college for Christmas vacation. One evening, the girl was curled up in a novel in front of a roaring blaze in the fireplace. Her parents were going out for dinner. They had invited their daughter to join them, but Susan had chosen to stay home and relax. For this reason, the Macmillans made it a point not to be away for very long. Even so, they returned to discover that they were too late. Their daughter met them at the door, already packed to return to college. It took nearly an hour of parental prodding and reassurance to convince the girl to tell them what had upset her so. It seems that as Susan was enjoying her book, a movement in the room caught her peripheral vision. She looked up and was horrified to see a strange man in the house. Worse, this man was not any kind of normal intruder, for he had walked out of a closet by passing right through a closed door. Like the men her mother had seen a few weeks earlier, this phantom walked down the hall into the bathroom before vanishing. The girl had been convinced herself that the manifestation had been caused by remnants of the exam stress that she had suffered while away at school. She did not want her parents to worry about her mental health, so she had decided that it would be best if she returned to her dorm immediately. Although it must not have been much of a consolation, the Macmillans were able to assure the frantic young woman that while she was fine, the family home was undoubtedly haunted. As winter gave way to spring, the haunting moved outside the house for the first time. For example, croquet mallets left in one place would be found in another. Sometimes you get the idea that they are just pulling your leg and having fun, Mr. Macmillan revealed. At other times, it seems they are angry. The situation in the big, beautiful haunted house came to a head when Mrs. Macmillan ran screaming from the couple's bedroom. Mr. Macmillan ran to her side as quickly as he could, but found his wife incoherent. He accompanied his wife back to their bedroom, but all she could do was point to their bed. The man could have hardly believed his eyes, but he could certainly understand his wife's horror. There on the bedspread was the indented shape of a reclining human body. As they both watched, the indentation moved and changed shape, as if someone was sitting up. Oddly, rather than prompting the Macmillans to immediately put their house on the market, that particular incident led only to their naming the household phenomenon Sam. They also began to research the home's short history. While they were never able to account for the ghosts, they did discover that the first owner had lived in the house for just a few months. The next was a young couple to whom the first owner rented the house on a short 6-month lease, but the couple did not manage to stay in the house even that long. The Macmillans could certainly guess the reasons that none of the previous occupants had stayed any longer. Moreover, Mr. Macmillan began to suspect that the excellent deal he had negotiated on their home had been the result of the seller's desperation, not his own well-honed business abilities. From that point on, the living came to something of an understanding about the dead occupants of the house, realizing that the ghosts were truly in a world of their own, seemingly unaware of anything taking place in the present day. The family began to make an effort to ignore the entities. After all, the ghosts were certainly not going to harm anyone. They were merely carrying on their lives, or perhaps, more correctly, their afterlives. Mr. Macmillan did admit that it was unnerving to know that there was the only one at home while listening to water running behind a closed bathroom door. Worse, however, was hearing the taps shut off, watching the door open, and seeing no one there. At last report, the haunting was still active, because Mr. and Mrs. Macmillan would be quite elderly by now. It is doubtful that they still live in the haunted house in Kirkland. However, if anyone reading this book is contemplating buying an apparent real estate bargain, you might do well to carefully check the house's history before signing the dotted line. Most folks would probably not adapt to living in a haunted house as well as the Macmillans did back in the 1960s. Hopefully you've enjoyed this next part of Chapter 1, Haunted Houses, The Castle, and Sam Lives Here. We'll see you soon with our next episode of Ghost Stories of Washington. Bye for now. Take care, and we'll see you next time. What was that? I thought I heard something. Guess not. It was just probably my imagination.